Hello and welcome to week 9. Can you believe it? Week 9 already. It's unbelievable to me. So here we are. We're raring to go, and we've got a big week. Just like last week, we've got two things to talk about this week, and just like last week, they have to do with slavery and sectionalism. And the first is where we'll start. So you are now the book here is probably not the version that you have. There are many different volumes of Frederick Douglass. There's even one that's just on or many just online also. But I wanted to talk about a few different sections of the book just to sort of put the paper in more context. Of course, we're still looking for the same two themes that we were looking for last week. What was more important than maintaining discipline within slavery, physical or psychological control? Give clear examples of both and make a clear argument for physical or psychological control. Or argue that there's some combination between those. What you shouldn't do, I'm repeating what I said last week, what you shouldn't do is just say, it's just both. So here's physical, here's psychological, so now we're done. What you can do, though, is say that there is some unique historical combination of the physical and or psychological combination, I guess, of physical and psychological trauma that you can't separate the two. You could easily argue something like that. And in fact, if you really want to be wise, go out and find some psychologist or email your psychology professor and ask, what is the connection between physical abuse and psychological abuse? Are they connected? How? Then you could add some theory behind what you're saying. Certainly don't have to do that, but it's just one idea to make an even more interesting paper. So that's one part of or one possible essay you could write about. A second one is the education in the slave system. If you remember, what we're looking at there is what type of educational system produced American slaves? What were the key features of the system and how effective was it? When we look at Douglass, we can see some of those features. And in fact, when we look at this narrative, we can see both of those questions coming through loudly and clearly. So let's look at a few passages in Douglass. I'm not going to give you page numbers because they're going to be different in yours. But I will simply say you'll be able to find these. I don't know how you could find them, but you'll be able to look them up if you want. But this one will start at the very beginning. So this one is when Douglass says, unless he's talking about how unnatural slavery is. That there's something about slavery that is incredibly unnatural. That it takes away all of the natural goodness in a person. This might be a part of the educational system, or it might be a part of the psychology of slavery. This works for both questions, as many of these quotes will. So, slavery is so unnatural because it takes away a person's natural inclination to care for his or her children. So you see, he says, how can one stand by and see one white son tie up his brother of but few shades darker complexion than himself, and ply the gory lash to his naked back? So here we have a recognition on the part of Douglass that the slave owner is probably also father to some on the plantation. So there is that. Then we move ahead into, well, this looks like it would be at the beginning of chapter 6, and we have both issues dealt with in chapter 6 as well. So he's talking about Mrs. Auld, A-U-L-D, and he says that there's some natural goodness in her, that her natural goodness is to reach out. She sees something in Frederick Douglass, and she wants him to develop something about himself, even as a slave. So she basically teaches him how to read. If you've ever taught someone how to read, it's very simple. You just go one letter, one sound at a time, small words, Dr. Seuss, right? You just go bit by bit. That's where Douglass is with Mrs. Auld. And Mrs. Auld teaches him the ABCs and starts to spell out a word or two here and there. But as it says here, when Mr. Auld found out what was going on, he forbade Mrs. Auld to instruct me further, telling her, among other things, it was unlawful as well as unsafe to teach a slave to read. And basically what Mr. Auld will tell her is that this is going to ruin a slave. If you've got a system where a piece of the educational programming is designed toward keeping slaves ignorant, you know that that system is fraudulent. If the system is trying to keep learning away from slaves, you know that they are, that at its heart, what slavery wants to do is mentally condition the slave to be in his place, to stay in her place, to accept things as they are. It is the exact opposite of what we want from education for you. For you, we want your education to release you, to give you opportunities, and to help you move forward into whatever world you want to create, right? So Mrs. Auld is a great example. Whenever there's someone who shows any kindness in this book to Douglas, they are often then undermined. He loves to do this to people as a part of his story. And so it's not just that Mrs. Auld is, I think it's Mrs. Auld who becomes very cruel. Is that her? So it's not just that she stops teaching him to read, she also then becomes cruel. And think about the position for these women on the plantations. I mean, we tend to think, okay, the victims of the plantation system, the victim of that evil is the slave men and women, slave children. Those are the victims. But think about how that system impacts women, white women in the South as well. So here they are living on a plantation, and they would suddenly look around and see, wait a minute, this young slave, this 4 or 5-year-old slave, seems to have the same nose as my husband. Ah, what's going on? Well, you know what's going on, right? So then the women become even more cruel than the husbands in some ways, and the women are often the ones who get slave children sent off to other plantations, and you can imagine why. So in that setting, the evil begets these other evils. The evil of slavery leads to the evil of this sexual abuse, and is part and parcel of that system. So there we have it. Here is Douglas again talking about this looks like chapter 7. Douglas again is talking about his education and about the enslavement of his mind. And what he says here is that reading for him is absolutely torture. It really, what he says is, the more I read, the more I was led to abhor and detest my enslavers. I could regard them in no other light than a band of successful robbers who left their homes and gone to Africa and stolen us from our homes, and in a strange land reduced us to slavery. So here is Douglas writhing under slavery, suffering under slavery, and his condition is made even worse by the fact that he reads. At least in his ignorance, he could not understand the full depth of slavery, but now he does. He talks more about that system, about the discipline and the psychology and the educational side of it with Mr. Covey. So he's sent to Covey to break him. Remember this? Dun, 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 chapter 10. And as he says, Covey succeeds in breaking him. Here's a very clear argument for the physical. It's Covey's physical brutality toward Douglas that ends up breaking him, right? And then eventually, of course, he will fight back. And he has, did you notice how long that fight was with Covey? I think Douglas would have been quite the MMA athlete. We were at it for nearly 2 hours, he says. He fights with Covey for 2 hours. Can you imagine a street fight that lasted 2 hours? Isn't that? I just wish we had a video of it. I just wish we could see it. But as he says, this battle with Covey, it is the absolute turning point in his life. Physically, he lets it be known he will have to be killed if he's going to be dominated anymore. But more than that, it really, as he says, it inspired me again with a determination to be free. So here we have the physical violence of that fight. His physically defeating a famous slave breaker at the time leads to him having a mental change that he will be free now. as he says. He talks more about the educational side and the psychological side of slavery when, just after this fight with Covey, he says, "It was deemed a disgrace not to get drunk at Christmas, and he was regarded as lazy indeed who had not provided himself with the necessary means during the year to get whiskey enough to last him through Christmas." Really what that part is about is that the slave owners want the slave mind to be occupied. In the same way, I'm going to try not to go too much on a tangent here, but the same way that our modern existence is almost engineered toward us being occupied. It's engineered toward us being so busy that we have no margins in our lives, that we wake up and we are absolutely controlled, self-controlled, for every moment of our day, until there's really no time to stop and contemplate and read and think and share things of significance, because we are so overwhelmingly burdened by the torture that is our own schedule. Douglass and the slaves had that same sort of burden of overscheduling and of things to think about throughout the year. What you would be obsessed with throughout the year was not acquisition of more crap like we are, but acquisition of a little bit of money, a little bit of an allowance that they may have given you, or money that you had earned from other slaves, and then you want to set that aside so that at Christmas you can get drunk. And why do you want to get drunk at Christmas? Why would the slave owners stand around and watch? What did that do for the slave owners? Because they would stand around and watch their slaves who had gotten drunk and are now having all of the sort of fun that's associated with drunkenness. The partying, the dancing, but then also the fighting, the frolicking, all of this going together with the drinking. And then for the slave owners, this is very clear, and Douglass sees this. It is a part of the fraud of slavery. The holidays are a part of the fraud of slavery, because what it represents is a little minuscule amount of freedom. The slave gets that freedom, and what is freedom? It's drunkenness. Well, drunkenness is a type of freedom, but what's the day after drunkenness? It's a hangover. So freedom for these slaves has a very clear hangover. The result of freedom is a grand headache. And wouldn't you rather, the slave system would want you to believe, wouldn't you rather just stay a slave and keep the mindset of a slave and not worry about Christmas? Well, that's sort of the underlying message of Christmas. It's the underlying message of preachers who went into the South, who were warned, you better not bring up this one book in the Bible that is all about leaving slavery, right? You better not even bring up the title of it. So let's just avoid Exodus. We're going to leave that book out. But you can tell slaves all you want that the slaves obey their masters, that the meek shall inherit the earth. You can tell them the story about Noah and Ham and the curse. And you can tell them these things that will keep them in line and that will help them to imbibe the message of a hierarchy of a world where the slave owner is at the top and the slave himself or herself is at the very bottom. So continue to think about these things as you work through your paper. And then also I'm going to do something a little bit different with the blog this week. So look for the directions on the blog. But basically you're going to see something that looks like this. Your only blog work this week is going to be to take one of these little issues that you see and describe it. And you're going to do two things with it on the blog. You're going to say, for instance, I'll put Kansas, well, these will all be up here, but where it says Kansas-Nebraska Act. Okay, so if a classmate has already done it, then you don't need to, or you can just sort of build on what they've said. So we're going to use each other as a sort of study guide creating mechanism. So Kansas-Nebraska Act. Here's Kansas-Nebraska Act. You'll go on the blog and and then go find the information elsewhere in your textbook or on Wikipedia. I don't really care. And you'll find out what is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Someone will define it. So that's the first thing, define it. It's a law that's passed in 1854 that determines how we're going to establish these new territories. It determines through this idea of popular sovereignty that Kansas and Nebraska that slavery will be voted on in those territories. And then someone else is going to chime in and say, how is that a part of the road to war? How is this a part of the road to war? And then basically what we're going to be doing is filling out this whole part of the blog as a study guide. It's going to help us sort of prepare for the final and get us up toward the point where we are ready and raring to go for that face-to-face final. I'm going to post the times for that. I'll email some information about that, and so you'll know exactly what's going to be there. But focus first on your slavery essay. That is the more pressing concern. That is due on November 16th, and we will, and I can answer any questions about that. The information about that is all in the blog. So by all means, just go and have a good week, and I will look forward to seeing you online and look forward to answering any questions you may have. So go off, write brilliant things about slavery, and have a great week.